G'day, this is Dave Boyle, and today I'd like to introduce a new system for teaching decorative thread art called Wrapsticks. What you can see on the screen is a set of templates which are designed to show you how to set up and complete a decorative wrap step by step with accompanying videos and tutorials. It's aimed at the absolute beginner who's never done a cross wrap before, as well as intermediate wrappers who'd like to practice their techniques and improve their skills. So please watch the videos that I've put together describing the Wrapsticks system, and I hope it helps you to get into the wonderful world of decorative thread art. Here is a virtual look at the Wrapsticks template showing how it looks both when it has been cut out and also when it's been applied to a piece of dowel. In the following video, I'll take you through the steps needed to successfully apply the template to a piece of dowel in anticipation of beginning a decorative wrap. G'day everyone, I'd like to show you how to apply the Wrapsticks template to the dowel. So this is what the Wrapsticks template looks like. It's downloadable from threadcentral.net, and by applying it to the dowel, it gives you a working space that helps you learn how to lay threads in anticipation of becoming good at doing decorative wraps. So if I show you the things that you'll need, obviously the first thing you'll need is this Wrapsticks template. Threadcentral.net is where that's available. You'll need some dowel. So this is a length of dowel that's 50 centimeters long, which is around 20 inches. The actual length is not particularly important, but I find if it's a bit longer, you have a bit more space to anchor the dowel on your rod supports, and you've got enough space to then work the decorative thread area. If you have too short a length of dowel, you'll be holding the dowel and then you'll be very cramped trying to do the work. So I found that about 20 inches, 50 centimeters is about the right length. What you'll also need is some glue stick. So the brand's not important. I like this one. It's a purple glue stick that disappears as it dries. And then you'll need some tape as well. The actual size of the tape is not particularly important, but I would recommend something wider rather than something more narrow. This is about not quite an inch wide, or maybe it is an inch wide, say a bit over 20 millimeters wide. I'd prefer something a bit wider than this. The tape is used to anchor your threads as you do the wrap, and having it wider gives you a bit more surface area and it'll hold those threads more securely. So there are some instructions on the template, and if we look at the instructions, it says cut out then glue the back side of this area. So you can see that there's a dotted line which surrounds the template, and the idea is we're going to cut that out with scissors, and then we'll follow the instructions on the template telling you how to glue along the bottom and top edges, and then to roll the print out around the dowel so that this bottom edge sticks first. So what I've done already is to cut out the template around the dotted lines. The important thing is making sure that these edges are cut reasonably straight, because when we wrap this around the dowel, those edges have to meet up, and if you've cut it not very straight, you'll have a difficult time making a nice join where those edges meet. So what we'll do is take the template which we've cut out, and we will apply the glue as directed. And the idea is to start along one edge, say the bottom edge, and put a nice amount of glue there. And then we want to line that up as straightly as we can against the bottom of the dowel. Not sure how well you'll see this on the screen, but you want to have it so that the template is straight compared to the dowel, and then we roll it and apply quite a bit of pressure with your fingers so that it starts to take, and then roll it up towards you, and then help the edge of that template take by rubbing your finger along it several times. and then we'll do a test fit before we apply more glue, and we'll roll it around. And what you should find is that the edge of one end lines up nicely with the printout on the other. You'll find that it won't be perfect. In an ideal world, we'd have a perfectly cylindrical dowel, we'd have a perfectly sized template, and we would not have to do any thinking because it would all line up perfectly for us. The reality is that these dowels are sometimes not 100% round. Sometimes we've cut the template a little bit too long or a little bit too short, and it's not perfect. But what you'll find is that near enough is good enough in this case, and as we lay the threads, you'll find how important it is to do the packing, because being able to pack your threads is the way that we recover from not having a perfectly symmetrical template. So what I'll do now, knowing that that will line up reasonably well, is I'll take my glue stick again, apply the glue to that edge, and then roll it around. And what you'll then see is that we have a nicely applied template to our dowel. And what I was saying about ensuring that it lines up, basically we should be able to follow, say, this black line, this black dotted line across, and it should continue at the same angle on the other edge that's joined. And we can see that, yes, it does not line up 100% perfectly, but it's good enough. And this will be easily good enough for us to do our work on. So that's how you apply the template to a length of dowel. And in the next video, I'll show us getting started with laying threads. G'day everyone. So in this video, I'd like to show you how to prepare the wrap stick for laying of threads. So in the last video, we showed how to apply the template using a glue stick and wrapping the template around a piece of dowel. And in this video, we'll show how to use some tape to prepare the ends to receive the threads. So I mentioned in the last video that the tape to use wider is better than more narrow. So in this case, we first of all look at the end that says tape, sticky side out. We can see that that's at both ends, but what we're going to do is start at one end, and we're going to apply this tape so that the sticky side ends up facing outwards, and that will be a good anchoring point for our threads. So what we do is line up our tape so that the edge of the tape is in line with this black line. So I'm going to place my tape here and wrap it around, say, 1 revolution. And then once that is in place, make sure it's firmly anchored. We then want to double the tape back over itself. And we want to be able to hold that fairly tight so that we get a nice snug fit. So I'm pulling on that reasonably tight, and we then need some way of cutting that tape. So you could use a razor blade, or I'm going to use some thread snips. So I now have one side with tape applied, and then we do similarly for the other side. Place the tape, wrap at least 1 revolution, make sure it's firmly anchored, and then double back the other way. What you'll find is that other people who are far more advanced at decorative wraps than myself may recommend other methods. I find this is simple, straightforward, and does the job. And in terms of learning how to place threads onto the wrap stick, this will do the job very easily. What we'll find is, as we lay more and more threads, these pieces of tape will get full of threads, and we'll have to apply additional layers partway through the wrap. And in some cases, we may actually have to apply additional thread either side of the original tape that's been laid. So that's all good. That's all fine and to be expected. And what you'll find is that if you do some Googling, you'll see different methods of applying threads. Getting a book, something like Decorative Wraps by Billy Vivona, is a great way to learn how to apply threads and to understand decorative wraps. Watching videos by Mary Christie, her Teachable series, is a fantastic way of seeing in practice different ways of doing wraps, different techniques, setting up wraps, following particular procedures to end up with certain patterns. All of these are great ways of learning about different sorts of wraps. So they are some of the resources that you have available. Just before we get into physically laying threads onto the Wrapstick, I'd like to show you what sequence will be fired for this particular pattern. The pattern is a type of cross, and the sequence fired is cross out, box out. This means there's a centre black cross moving outwards at the same rate as a surrounding red box. Each of the lines drawn on the screen represent the threads you'll be laying onto the Wrapstick to form the pattern. And I've drawn these lines on the screen with a small gap between each thread, simply so that you can see more clearly where the next threads are appearing. When you actually wrap this on the Wrapstick, each of those gaps need to be packed until you don't see any gaps at all. Here's a quick look at how the pattern, which you've seen in 2D, will also look in 3 dimensions. G'day. In this video, I'd like to show you how to start laying threads on your Wrapstick. In this particular pattern that I'll be wrapping, the sequence is cross out, box out. So what that means is I need to lay a single cross surrounded by a single box. And on this template, the cross layout is identified by the black thread, and the box layout is identified by the red thread. And I'll show you how I apply the threads, starting and ending at the tape, which has the sticky side out, and then starting and stopping the different colours at the right time in the pattern. So the size thread you use is not particularly important. What you'll see is as you use different size threads, you'll achieve different textures within the pattern. And as you practice more and more, you'll refine your style and understand what size threads work best for you. So for this particular example, what I'm going to do is start by laying the initial cross and see how we go. So I'm going to start by placing my black or very dark blue thread facing away from the wrap and give it, say one revolution, and then start to wrap back the other way. And the reason I do that is the tape starts to hold the thread, but as I apply a bit of pressure, by having the thread wrap over itself, that anchors the thread even more securely, and so I can then apply a bit more tension, and I know that that thread is not going to come off the tape. So what our challenge now is to start laying this dark thread so that it goes over the top of the black cross. And what I have found works best for me is to hold the spool in my hand in this position and get quite a distance. So my hand is going to go off camera now, but have a reasonable distance so that I've got good control over the angle of the thread. And as I bring the thread down on the rod, or on the blank in this case, the Wrapstick, what I'm trying to do is make sure that this thread lies directly over the top of the initial printout. I was saying before in a previous video that you'll find the edges of the templates probably do not line up perfectly. It won't be an exact line up, but you'll find that the thread is reasonably forgiving, and as you progress through the pattern you can pack threads one way or the other to make sure they end up in a suitable position anyway. So as you can see, as you probably can't see, my left hand is turning the wrap stick, and with my right hand I'm holding the threads, and I'm just making sure with my right hand that the angle of the threads is correct, and I know it's correct because I'm laying straight over the top of the black dotted line on the template. So once I get to one end, I continue at the same angle, and in my case I'm going to wrap to the edge of the tape and then start to come back, and we basically want to repeat what we did first time round. So I have to find where a good entry point is to start approaching. So here we go. I'm coming in to make sure that I start wrapping on the dotted line, the black dotted line at the right angle. And I do my best to lay it over the top. What we can see is that this template has been set up for a square pattern, and what that means is the threads are crossing at 90 degrees. Most patterns that you see are square patterns, and this template is set up for a square pattern as well. So I'll continue wrapping that, doing my best to keep the angle right, so I lay over the top of that black dotted line and then give it a couple of turns, because what I'm about to do now is to cut this dark thread, and the last thing I want to have happen is to have that thread unravel. So in my case I'm wrapping it around a couple of times to make sure that I've got good adhesion to the tape, and then I snip that off and just make sure that it's held down. So the next thing I need to do is to start wrapping my lighter coloured thread, and in this case I'm going to use a red thread. So I start that red thread off in the same way that I started the dark thread. I start wrapping away from where I want, and then I double back so that I'm anchoring the threads. I then want to find the right angle to approach so that as I come into the pattern I'm at the right angle. So you can see here that I'm laying over the top of the red dotted line, and I'm doing the first thread in a box layout. It's called a box because it forms basically a square box surrounding the initial black layout cross, and I'll continue that, always adjusting with my right hand to make sure that the angle is right, and trying to maintain a consistent amount of pressure on that thread. The idea with the Wrapsticks is you can try out different techniques. You can try out more pressure, you can try out less pressure. One question that many people ask is, what's the right amount of tension to place on your wrap? And unless you start doing some wraps, you'll probably never know, because it's not something that's easy to describe in words or even watching. What you need to do is to do some wraps and probably fail the first few, but see for yourself what works. So in my case, I'm putting I call it a medium amount of pressure on the thread. So there's enough pressure to hold it in place, but there's not so much pressure that everything is stressed. It's not pulling itself off the tape with the sticky side out, and it is loose enough so that when it comes time to packing, I am able to move those threads around. So right now I've done two sides of that box. I'm now going to find the third side according to the template. Here we go. I'm finding the third side of that box, I'm wrapping again over the red dotted line. With my right hand, I'm just making sure the angle of the thread is right. I'm gradually I'm only holding the edges of or the ends of the spool with my fingers. I'm not actually touching the threads. I don't want to get oil from my fingers all over the threads. And I'm using my fingers to adjust the pressure on that spool. So I keep wrapping. And then once I get to the right hand side, I then double back. Again, looking for the right angle of re-entry. So I can see from the printout, this is where I need to come into the pattern. So I continue wrapping at this angle by following the dotted line. And as I approach the end, what I'll be doing is anchoring this red thread and then cutting it off, making sure that there are sufficient turns in my anchoring procedure to make sure that it's not going to quickly unravel. What you'll find is as you put more and more threads, the threads on top hold or anchor the threads below. Just be aware that if you were to pause and walk away, those threads might want to unravel, so you may actually want to put a wrap of tape over the top to keep them in place if you were to pause and have a break. So there you go. We've just laid our first layout threads on a cross out, box out style of pattern. We've followed the dotted lines on the template, and by doing this, we've ensured that these threads are at the right angle. We've laid them at the right angle. It means that the crosses and the crossing points on the thread are all at 90 degrees. And why that's important is that we want this pattern to eventually close. And if we do not get the layout threads laid at the right angle, you'll find that the pattern won't close nicely. So a more advanced technique once you start wrapping onto actual rods is called taper offset layout. And what that does is it accounts for the taper of the blank, and it adjusts the distance between these spaces or these crossing points, these initial crossing points. For this dowel, because the dowel is straight and there is no taper, if you were to measure the distance between these points, that measurement would be consistent. What you'll find is once you start wrapping on actual rods, depending on the taper, you'll find that this distance won't always be consistent and you'll have to adjust for that. But again, that's one of the advantages of wrapping on a dowel to start with and using the Wrapsticks method. It means those decisions are already made for you, and you can simply follow along the dotted lines, and you know that you're off to a good start. So with these threads in this position, I know that I'm in a good position to start this wrap. So in this video, I'll start laying down the threads to continue with the cross out, box out style pattern that we've started. We've already laid the initial layout threads. We are now going to continue the pattern. So I start by, first of all, anchoring the threads for the cross, which is going to move outwards. And so I'm laying this thread adjacent to the original cross thread that I started with. You can see I'm laying it off to one side, laying it reasonably close to the original thread, trying to keep a similar tension to what I used before. And then once I reach one end, I then double back on itself, and again, laying at the same angle, I start to wrap back down the rod again. Now what's important is that we will make multiple passes, meaning similar sort of shape that we're wrapping, but each time we lay a new set of threads, it'll be to one side or the other side of the original layout threads. What's important is that we follow the same sort of pattern, or you can see that the first two threads I've laid have basically been above the initial layout thread, and now these next two threads are going to basically be below the original layout threads, and we want to maintain that consistency as we go throughout the pattern. What is most comfortable for me is if I start by wrapping above the original threads and then finish by wrapping below the original threads. Other people follow a slightly different. Maybe they'll start under the original threads and then above the original threads. It all depends on what you're comfortable with. As long as you're consistent, you don't want to be swapping the sequence which you're wrapping partway through the wrap. You want to maintain consistency throughout that wrap. So you can see I'm coming back now on this pass of out. So this means we've now done a single pass of the out progression, and then we want to do similarly for the red thread. So we again anchor the threads, come back, and then again, as I was saying, I start by going above the original layout threads, getting them as close as I can to the layout threads. If you wrap with too much tension and wrap it too close, you might find that you pull and move and shift the original layout threads. You don't really want to do that. You want to keep those threads in place and wrap reasonably close to them. Even if there are gaps as you're putting them down, you can pack out those gaps later. In the finished wrap, you don't want to see any gaps. That's a big no-no. But as you progress with the pattern and lay more and more threads, you'll have the opportunity to pause and then start to pack. So I've already gone above the original layout threads. Now I'm going below the original layout threads. So you can probably start to see that if I continue following this progression of outwards, the original layout threads will tend to move outwards from the original position, and that's where the out terminology comes from. We start with threads in an initial position, and relative to the last threads, the next threads are wrapping outwards. So as I finish up this pass, I'm rushing a little for the video. Normally I'd take a little bit more time and be a little bit more careful as I place the threads. I'm making sure they are properly anchored, and then I cut that off. I'm now going to do just a little bit of packing. This tool is the Nurbs packing tool. So threadcentral.net has these available. They have a honed end. It's like a three-sided end, and once that tool is prepared, it's nice and smooth at the end so that you don't cut any threads. But you can use the edge of that tool to close little gaps. So if I find a major gap, for example here, you can see that I can press that inwards, typically pressing inwards at the crossing points, and that will start to close the threads and close up the gaps. I'm doing this early in the wrap for the purpose of this video, but what you'll find in practice is you might want 3 or 4 passes down before you actually start doing the packing, and you'll find then the number of threads there help to hold the other threads in place, and your packing will become more efficient. So you could spend as long as you want tidying up that pattern and making sure that the threads are packed nicely. All the time you're still trying to maintain the original positions of the initial layout, because if those initial layout threads move, then the whole pattern will not be symmetrical, and you'll find on a closed wrap that won't close properly. So I'm going to continue with this pattern now, and you'll see how the pattern finishes up. So here I've done another set of passes, and I want to do a bit of packing. So using my packing tool, I start to push threads together, pushing typically at the corners. Wrapping a pattern that goes out, I would typically pack inwards, and vice versa. And the idea is we want to close up any obvious gaps. And what you'll find is that where the dark threads cross the light threads, that is where the pattern starts to form. So it's important that there aren't any gaps, because that would upset the look of the pattern. We try to pack as carefully as we can. If your threads are too tight, if your packing tool is too sharp, and if you're too aggressive with it, there's a chance that you'll pop some threads. We would try to avoid that. Trying to get nice, consistent packing of the threads. And the more that you work on the pattern, more and more it'll start to come together. And for me, that's the exciting part. At one stage, your pattern looks like a random jumble of threads everywhere. And the more that you wrap, the more that you pack, the more that you pay attention to it, suddenly the pattern starts to appear. And for me, that's where the magic lies. I remember wrapping the first one or two patterns and being absolutely blown away and amazed with the fact that I was creating some sort of artistic pattern out of purely straight lines. I just couldn't believe it. And I guess that fascination has stayed with me throughout my life. I don't find much time these days to do much wrapping, unfortunately. However, the fascination still is there, and that's why I'm so keen to teach people about the art, help them to understand with resources how to make these patterns. When I first started out, there was maybe one book that I found on the topic, and not much else. These days we're spoilt for choice. We've got Facebook and YouTube and various publications. They've each got their strong points and their benefits, but we're somewhat spoilt for choice, to the extent that sometimes it makes it hard these days to know where to start if you're just starting out. And that's where I saw a need for something like the Wrapsticks system, which in some regards limits your choices up front, simply so that you don't get overwhelmed with the number of choices that are out there. Obviously, what I'm doing now is not a particularly high quality wrap when you compare it to some of the amazing wraps that are done by Billy Vivona or Mary Christie or any of the Nurbs. You only have to go onto the Nurbs Facebook group or the Southern Rod Builders Facebook group to see some of the amazing work that's done there. But by using the Wrapsticks, I'm hoping to get people wrapping, making a system that's not intimidating to use. You can see that I'm making mistakes as I go. I'm not packing particularly well, and you may notice that some of my threads aren't in exactly the right space, but that's fine. I'm learning as we go as well. So hopefully you're starting to see the thinking behind the WRAPStix method. It's to let you practice, let you try out, let you understand how patterns form, and the more you do, the better you'll become, and hopefully you'll develop your own style and start to apply these to rods that you make yourself. So now we can starting to see a bit of a cross pattern starting to form in the middle. As we add more and more passes, that cross pattern will develop even further. So another pass of thread has gone down, and I've just spent some time packing that pass. As you can see, the pattern is starting to form nicely. You might notice that at this end the thread is quite thick, or the tape is getting quite thick, and that's because that's where I'm starting and stopping the threads, and I'm finding that I'm needing to add additional layers of tape every so often in order to maintain a good surface to anchor those threads onto. So you'll find you have to do that as well, depending on how many turns you make at each end. You'll have to keep topping up the amount of tape that's at either end. I'm finding that I can simply top up the tape on this end because that's where I'm starting and stopping threads, and the other end where I'm turning, I'm able to simply leave that as is. Another set of passes has gone down. I've spent some time packing. As you can see, we're getting close to the cross forming completely. Still got a few more dark blue threads that can go in there. As we are packing and laying threads, you can see that there's a seam line which is visible where the threads are crossing. As you progress with your skill level, the goal is to keep that seam as straight as possible. And the sign of a good wrap is a dead straight seam that goes straight across the pattern. So pay attention to that if you can. And as you progress with your skills, you'll be able to see your wraps improving. So I'm part way through another set of passes, and I cut off my dark thread in order to start my red thread, and unfortunately the dark thread started to unravel, and you can see I've got a very loose pass there now. So no dramas, we can just unwrap that last pass, and then holding it firmly with my right hand, I find where that last pass needs to go again and simply put it back into place. And then once I make it to the other end, what I'll be doing is wrapping it around the tape so that it's anchored, but understanding that perhaps there's not enough adhesion in that tape now to hold it. I'm just going to hold it there with my fingers while I get my tape again and wrap another row of tape over it. And that way I'm sure that it won't unravel again. And you may notice that I'm making a bit of a ramp here. If I wrap the tape directly over itself, I'll end up with a massive step there. And the problem with having the step is that as the thread comes off that step, it makes for an aggressive angle, which is then difficult to have the thread come into the pattern at the right angle. So I tend to find by making a bit of a ramp there, it helps me to ease the thread into the angle it needs to go, and that way my threads seem to lay more nicely. So the wrap is now ready for one more pass. And once I do that, the wrap would then be ready for the closing of the background. So the last pass that forms the pattern has gone down, and I've spent some time packing it. You can see that the red threads at the edges don't want to stay in place because they need some background threads to hold them in place. But the actual pattern, the star formation has formed quite nicely, and that's what we were setting out to do. And here's a virtual look at the finished wrap in both 2D and 3D. That brings us to the end of the Wrapsticks tutorial video. I hope you've enjoyed seeing how to use the template, and I look forward to seeing photos posted on the wraps you've been able to complete using this system. Remember to visit threadcentral.net for more information and resources. Tight wraps.